ladies and gentlemen. I do hope this has worked. Welcome from everywhere that you are. We are live and broadcasting and talking about Scottish research and Scottish ancestors today. It's a wonderful topic, and welcome from Dundee as we talk. Hopefully, we're all going to learn some great new things today. It's day 370 something, I think, of this lockdown, and hopefully you've all been getting involved in some family history while you've been cooped up and kept safely away from anything and any problems. I know we've got some questions that have been asked a little earlier, so we'll look at some of those. Hi there, Ben. Nice to see you. And then we'll have a bit of a chat, and I'll share some general resources. And if you have any more questions, get them into the comments as well. Hi there, William. Yes, very well in Scotland. It's good. I'm in sunny Dundee, and it is sunny today. I hear it's raining down south, but I'm very happily enjoying a little bit of sunshine through the window. So, without further ado, really, I'm going to look at some of these questions that have been put in earlier, and then try and answer a few, because I know you've asked some already. I see Margaret has said half of her ancestors are from Orkney and the other half are from Banffshire. She's used Findmypast and Scotland's People, both great websites. Yes, Scotland's People is a really good website, really useful. It's if you haven't used it, it's the website of the Scottish General Register Office. And that's where you'll find your images of birth, marriage, and death records. So that's really, really important, because those images will give you lots of extra information, and they help to give you the bare bones of which you then use Findmypast to fill in the gaps and to add the colour and the detail to the story. One of the great things that Findmypast has is a very detailed index of some of the records on Scotland's People. So one of the things I do is I use Findmypast to find the records I want, and then go to Scotland's People to get the images, because you have to pay for each image. There's no subscription, and the last thing you want to do is to buy records that you don't need for someone else's family. So that's why I use that as my way to work things. Findmypast has a huge amount of records for Scotland. We work with societies, archives, libraries, institutions, even individuals, to bring things together and to put them in one place so that you can hopefully find more about your ancestors. We are partners with a lot of Scottish family history societies, and their records are searchable on Findmypast. A lot of ways we've enhanced them and made them a little easier to find, and more usable than perhaps in a booklet. You can then just search by name, which is a fantastic addition. And of course that supports the societies as well when you use these records. So that's a great thing too. I notice Leona said her ancestors were Ulster Scots from Ireland. The surname is Campbell, so it's a fair bet they came from the west of Scotland, but they can only get back to their great-grandfather Robert Campbell in County Down with no dates or wife's name. My grandfather John, born about 1846 in County Down. After that, no records or too common a name to narrow it down further. My DNA shows some Scottish, but will I ever get back to the link in Scotland? Luckily, living in Edinburgh, I can get to the record office, but nowhere to start on this line. Frustrated. I can feel that frustration. It's one of the difficult ones. In terms of Northern Ireland in particular and the west of Scotland, when you look at things like genetic markers and things, there's very little between these places because the population moved so much between the two locations. This makes it a little more difficult, and there were no real records kept of those people hopping back and forth. However, this is something that's mentioned by a few people when they mention about Ulster Scots and those people who've come over there. There is one record set that might help, and it's a very, very, let's say it's a long shot, but we have to take these long shots. So I know that Ellie is in the comments and is ready to comment with different resources and things that we've mentioned and picked out. There's a record set of passenger lists, early passenger lists, very, very early passengers, so people travelling around, early emigration from Britain. And it stops in around about 1812, I think. Starts in the 1600s or maybe in the 1500s, if I remember rightly. And in there is about 33 records. This is why it's very small indeed. Possibly the only records that exist of people migrating from Britain, from the mainland, to Ireland. And they're just about the time of the plantations of Ulster. They're from Chester. So if you go to the record set, which hopefully will be posted, then you'll be able to see this. If you just set the parish as Chester for the source port, the place where people are leaving from, you'll then see these names. Those people are, we suspect, going over to Ireland to be part of these plantations, and they may well be your ancestors. It's a long shot, as I said. It's in the sort of 1630s, I think, at the time, so it's the height of the plantations. And that might be your connection. So I said it's the only record we know of that survives that has this, but it's worth a look, and that might help you. In terms of Irish research and those people in Northern Ireland as well, Brian Donovan, my wonderful colleague, did a very good presentation on Irish research that I think would explain far better than I could what to look at and where to go. So I would look at that, and it's still on our little video library, so you can take a look at that anytime you want and go through at your own leisure. Really recommend that. Northern Irish records are slightly separated. There's Prony as well, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, and they have some records online as well, but many of them are not yet. Look at the North of Ireland Family History Society too, and they might also have some resources, as well as some on Findmypast as well. And I said that presentation will be really, really useful. I am just taking a look at some of the earlier questions as well. I notice, so Karen Boxall's 9 times great-grandparents, you've gone quite far back. Walter Minto married Mary Turnbull, or Marie Turnbull, 18th of November 1670 in Jedburgh and Roxburgh. She's keen to find out more about them and their ancestors. They've both got very interesting surnames. And we'll be happy if anyone got in touch who had those surnames too. So if you know of those ancestors, you can get in touch with Karen. She made a comment on one of her earlier posts. With a surname like Minto, I'm assuming, as Minto is near Howick in Roxburghshire, that maybe they've not travelled very far at all, and maybe they're from the area and they've been from the area for a long, long time. So perhaps that might be a place to really concentrate your research. The Borders Archive have a lot of material as well, and the Borders Family History Society also have some great resources too. Let's take a look at some more questions we've got as we go through. So Tracy Bedford would love to know how to slim down baptism records for a James Sutherland, born roughly 1725, presuming in Scotland due to the surname. He died in Norwich in Norfolk in 1800, age 74 75. No information about his parentage in either of his 2 marriages. He and another male with the spelling of Sutherland are the only males in Norfolk with this surname in about 1750, which is when James marries for the first time. Wondered if they came down to Norfolk due to the clearances or the Jacobite rebellion. James is my 6 times great-grandfather. So a few people in some of these questions have mentioned migration in the UK and in mainland Britain. And it's really interesting how, if you have ancestors in the east of Scotland, they tended to move along the east coast quite often. So you'll find people from Moray or Banff or anywhere like that, and sometimes, Sutherland and Caithness. They tend to move down the east coast, and they may end up in Aberdeenshire, or they may have started there, and they may move to Dundee or somewhere like that. And they'll move along that side. And the same on the west. People in the Western Isles and people from the west coast and Argyllshire often end up in places like Glasgow and places on this western side, the areas of sort of Lanarkshire and Hamilton, for coal mining and other different things too. So there is a pattern of migration. It's not exclusive. There are often, many, many exceptions. It's not a hard and fast rule like perhaps there are in other places, but it's a really good sort of individual marker. So some of your ancestors that have moved, along that coast, and we know that Norfolk is also on the east coast, and there's a bit of a marker that perhaps that may have how it happened, and that can give you a bit more of an understanding that this is a bit more plausible. But when we're looking at the Highland clearances and things like that, there weren't so many records of the clearances themselves, with the exception perhaps of estate records, which you could look at. But look at those people that you're pinning down up north, those people you're looking at north of the border that you have as possibles and work forwards. Try and tell their whole life story and see which ones disappear. If they're buried, perhaps in the same parish or nearby, and they're the right sort of age, and you know those aren't the people. So then you may find that there's only one that disappears. I would imagine with James Sullivan you might have more than one. But if you know where you're looking and which area these James Sullivans are in, then maybe some estate records might help. I have a wonderful resource that I'll get out at some point and show, which is an old exciseman's book from the Isle of Arran. If you have any ancestors from the Isle of Arran, do shout up from this sort of point, and I'll happily take a look in it for you. But it's was taken by the Earl of Hamilton before, it was also the Earl of Arran, before the clearances and after the clearances. So you see the names of the farmers beforehand and afterwards, and notes about those that had left and where they'd gone to, and their names. So these resources do exist. They tend to be privately held. Sometimes they're put in local archives, but they are there. But there are no sort of general government registers that tell you everything about that. So it's an interesting idea. Findmypast has a great Jacobite collection. It's really worth looking at too if you think your ancestors may have left due to this. But those who served in this kind of Jacobite army, which are quite known and named, tended to have been captured, and then they're named and they're punished, and we'll know a lot about them. Or they went home and carried on with their life, and if they weren't known, then they tried to keep a low profile. So it's an interesting idea, but I would lean more perhaps on the idea that they've moved down for perhaps because of those original clearances rather than being part of the Jacobite army or anything like that, and because the clearances were involved to remove Highland culture in a strange way rather than focused exactly on Jacobites themselves. It was just the idea that this culture was so different from British culture, it had to be removed to reduce the risk of any further rebellions. And so Gaelic was banned, wearing kilts, etc., and this sort of thing. Tartans were made illegal, and this came back later. It was actually only when I think it was George IV had a visit to Scotland, and it was Walter Scott who pulled off the greatest marketing campaign known to man, in which tartans, that all of you, I think, we talk about having tartan blood, and everyone, I see one of the big questions is, where is my family tartan? It's not really a thing. It's kind of an enterprising idea that you had a family tartan, and that's mainly because of Walter Scott and this great sort of tartan mania that came after this visit of royalty to Edinburgh. Your family probably did wear a tartan, but it was from a particular weaver nearby, and that weaver just made their pattern. So people whose families lived in a certain area may have all just gone to the same weaver who made that pattern, and that might be where you would find that, but it's not family related or anything like that. It's just down to the area, so it's very very different. And wearing a tartan, if someone says, this is my tartan, which tartans can I wear? The answer is any you like. That's fine. You can wear anything. Now, traditionally, it's become more of a sense of identification, and it shows that you identify with a particular family, and that's fine too. But, if you like a tartan, go for it. No one can stop you. It's fine. There are more rules around using the crests and things like that, and mottos of different families, and that's covered by the Court of the Lord Lion. And they're very, very strict on who can use a crest and for heraldry and things like that. But when it comes to tartan, just enjoy yourself, and that's fine. Let's answer some more questions before I go off into stories too much. We have Elizabeth Jeffery. 25% of my ancestors came from Caithness. I know many Scots moved abroad due to the clearances, but I'm interested in inward movement into Caithness in the 1700s. Are there any records I can use to research this? So that's a little harder. There are usually some parish records that can tell you about this. The Kirk sessions will be interesting. Hopefully they'll be online at some point soon. But Kirk sessions registers are kind of like a diary kept alongside the normal church books, and they tell you of different comings and goings. They might tell you if someone has joined a new parish or anything else, new additions. In terms of moving around the country, as we've seen some of these other questions, it's very difficult to tell when someone moved without, a particular register. People don't have to register in the same way as they may do. Nowadays we have lots of different ways to prove where we've lived at different points. Here, it's a little harder. I would look mostly with the church and start with that, and also look at social trends and a bit of social and local history to understand more about the area that people have moved to, maybe the industries that have grown or been decimated in different times, to see if maybe there's an explanation for why people came in. Sometimes you'll find migration patterns in that way. I think migration is fascinating. I could talk for a long time about that kind of thing. I know we talked about that last week too. Janet Jackson Pete has a question that I think we can help everyone with. My Scottish ancestors lived through the Culbin sandstorm, which is fascinating. You should really take a look at that if you have any time. Just Google that and find more of that story. Records later show them in Buckie and Banff. Are there any parish records from around that time that have survived? If so, how do I locate the records? So, for parish records, or OPRs in Scotland, as we call them, Old Parish Registers. So we have a lot of records to look through, but there's a really good link which I'm going to hopefully get Ellie to share, which is an old book that was created in the 1870s, I believe, and it's from the registrar for the National Records of Scotland, and it lists all of the existing parish registers and parish records that survive in Scotland at a later point. So this is really, really helpful, because this can tell you if you're on a hiding to nothing and you're looking for something that isn't going to be there because the records, maybe there were a fire, maybe there's some other reason. It's a little difficult. I have a real problem. I have an ancestor in Beath, and in Beath at this particular point when they're probably were born and baptized, there's a 20-year gap in the records for baptism. So I'm probably never going to find that person. And I have two possible sets of parents that are in the town at that sort of point, and I have their marriages, but I can't tell which one is the parent. And I'm a bit stuck, and maybe I have to find something else, and maybe Kirk sessions might help. Maybe there'll be something else, and I'm hopeful, but knowing that gap is there gives me an explanation. When I look and I find a zero, it means that perhaps my ancestors haven't moved from somewhere else, or perhaps anything else. They may still be where I'm looking. The records just don't exist. So that's really, really useful and important. So that's something to remember. Take a look at that link. I think Sylvia Valentine shared it as well as Ellie. Really, really useful, because it tells you different things to know about as well. So perhaps it gives you comments to say in 1851 there are actually only 2 baptisms recorded, so perhaps there aren't as many, even though that year is covered. So really, really useful. Let's take a look at some more. I'm going to try and round off some of these questions from Advanced, and then I'll move into all these live questions that are swinging past really, really quickly. So Sue, Kelley, you talked about your Irish ancestors coming from the border clans. So we mentioned Ulster Scots a little bit earlier. I said it's very, very difficult to look at those two between, but some of the comments you said earlier might help you. And Kath Gerard, my great-great-grandfather William Fraser, was one of 10 children of a farmer in Elgin. Born in Elgin, he's in Norfolk in the 1871 census. Again, that's along that east coast, so that might give you a little bit more of an idea. It's much easier to travel through water than it is on road until the railways start to become very, very cheap and things. A road journey might take you, a number of days, whereas traveling by boat might take you some hours. So that's quite useful, especially, I said, as we move along. So you'll find through history, coastal trade and coastal sort of conversation and movement was much, much over longer distances than those people who moved, over 20-mile radiuses when they're having to use their feet and maybe a horse. So let's take a look. So Margade, I think I pronounced that right. My great-great-grandfather was described in 1825 in one marish record in one parish as a mechanic from Grahamston and the other as a millwright in Barony. Might there be any records to show me who he worked for? He left Glasgow for London sometime between 1832 and 1853, looking at the birth records of his children. His 14-year-old son died in an accident in Maudley factory in Lambeth in 1842, if that gives any clues. Thanks a lot. So it's a little hard to work out because we've got private records, most likely. If you work for someone, there wasn't too much of a way to keep things. Mechanic is a very vague term at this sort of point. It doesn't mean, as we do now, repairing cars or anything like that. It just basically means you're a technical worker. So it stands to reason if he's a millwright then and he's still in the same sort of trade. Perhaps look at different mills, but I'm assuming that they'll be very small operations at this kind of point, and there will be private affairs. So I don't think you'll find too much in terms of big sets of records that are left. Looking at moving Glasgow to London at this sort of point, that's fairly normal. People want some, find their fortune, etc. That's quite common, and that can happen. I think you're mostly going to be looking at records, perhaps of trades, just general records. So look at things like apprenticeship registers. There are some of those, particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh. I think we have Edinburgh apprentices on our website and others. And there's also a great resource that I'm going to share, or have shared as well, which is full of all kinds of stories. It's one of those general stories and general resources that I wanted to make sure got shared. It's Burgess Rolls and Guild Brethren. So we have a fantastic index taken from all these different sources, and they're full of wonderful tales, because you get a Burgess ticket for being, a member of your guild and becoming a successful trader and being someone who's done well. Maybe you're a draper, or a hammerman, or a butcher or flesher, as they say in Scotland, or anything like that. But also you might get them for doing amazing deeds. So if you go to the Burgess and Guild Brethren Index, you will find things like, just type in that keyword section something like fire, and you'll find people who have saved babies from fires, or put out fires in town centres and things like that have been given then freedom of the city, and they've been given this ticket as a thanks for their gift. So it's a huge set. Some of these records, and this is one of the reasons it says about the fact that we've enhanced a lot of records that you can find elsewhere. So some of these Burgess records, not all of them, so many of them are exclusive. You'll find in some old books that you may have seen here as Scottish Record Society books. They're probably around about 120 years old and maybe more. And you can browse through them. They're interesting. But we've indexed them and made them fully searchable, which is really exciting, because you can type things in, touch of a button, you'll find everything. It's all fully indexed by name, by date, by place, and that is when these things come to life. And that means that you can find stuff that may be, hidden at the back of a book. It may be in the errata at the end. There's so many different reasons, so many different ways why, we may have to use a digital index, and it just really unlocks these things. And these are, I believe, the only place you'll find them in a searchable format like this, rather than the current sort of optical character recognition which you can use, which is a little bit hard to use and a little bit more difficult to browse through page by page. And on the same token, there's a great index that was indexed wonderfully by some of the volunteers that I know. Some of them are going to be in comments and watching, and they're fantastic. And some new volunteers I've been getting in touch with slowly over the past couple of weeks. If you volunteered to transcribe some records for us, it all really helps. Our Testament Index. So there are a set of, I think, around about 14 or 15, don't quote me on the number, books that were created by, again, the Scottish Record Society around about 120, 130 years ago, of testaments. And these are created in a slightly different way than the wills that we create nowadays, because you only really made a will when you thought death was going to happen, or you were going to go on some long, difficult journey. So if you became ill, you would then maybe write a will, or if you were about to move to America or something like that, to somewhere else, you might then do that. And Scotland is divided into these big sort of regional areas, or commissariats. And these commissariats covered a strange geographical area. So the commissariat of Glasgow covers parts of Ayrshire, covers parts of Lanarkshire, covers all kinds of areas, not just Glasgow itself. The commissariat of the Isles has bits of Inverness, bits of Argyllshire, bits of Buteshire, all these other different places. And you will find people who have property in these areas from very far away as well. And at this point, when we're looking at wills, these people tend to have property. So you might be looking at someone who's middle class or above, perhaps someone who's an artisan, or someone who's a skilled tradesperson. But we have gone through and we've taken all of these books and we've indexed them all. And the best thing about this is we've added location to about 2/3 of these, all the ones that we could find. So let's say you have an ancestor from Dundee, and that ancestor had property in Glasgow, or spent a lot of time doing business in Glasgow or something like that. So they had some assets there. Now they're searchable in that Glasgow book, through this whole one search. Really, really easy, really, really useful and helpful for the first time. I think this is the only place anywhere you'll find them all together, all completely name searchable, and with all of the books in one place, which is a really huge resource. Very, very helpful. And it goes all the way back to 1481. So if you've got some of these earlier ancestors, hopefully by then you've plugged into someone who had a bit of money. I still haven't found my family fortune, but every once in a while I'll find someone who's a little bit richer than you or I today, and they leave some wonderful records for us to find. So they can be the thing that plugs you into so much more. So do look at that as well. Let's take a look at some of these questions now that have come in. I think I've covered most of the advanced questions. So apologies to everyone who's been asking questions as we've been going. I'm going to try and run through and grab as many as I can. We've got half an hour left. Hi from sunny Inverness, Gillian. I'm glad it's sunny up there as well. It's amazing being in Dundee and still being down south there. Have you any hints on how to trace my grandfather, who was a prisoner of war in World War II? He was in the Black Watch. I'd love to learn anything about his army history, as my mum and uncle don't know anything. So the Black Watch, if I remember rightly, are the regiment from around Angus and Dundee, and so there are some wonderful records that may be coming fairly soon to Findmypast. So keep your eyes peeled; they might be able to help you with regards to World War II. But we have a great selection of World War II prisoner of war records on Findmypast. They're really, really useful, and they're exclusive, I believe. They've full of all kinds of details, so I would take a look at those. They were digitized, I think maybe about 6 months to a year ago, and we've kept adding to them, and they're a really, really good place to look and get started. For World War II, it's a great place to find information, and if you haven't applied to the Ministry of Defence for his service record, I would definitely do that as well. I know this comes up quite a lot. Any record after 1920 at the moment is held at the Ministry of Defence, and to get that you have to be next of kin or prove that that person is no longer with us, and when you do that they'll send you a copy of his full service history, and that is a huge document. It can be anything from 2 to 100 pages long, and it's full of all kinds of extra things and extra information. So I would do that specifically. I used my great uncle's record and found all kinds of extra information about where he was posted and all kinds of extra stuff. So that can be really useful. So I would definitely do that as well. But first of all, look at those Findmypast prison war records if you want to find something today, because there will be something useful for you. David Malcolm said, "There's Burgesses in the Royal Boroughs. There are the very few family. These are the very families that are subject on the St Andrews research." That's what's exciting, David. When all these records tie together, those records from all these different places come together in one place, and they help to fill the gaps. Scotland has, I think at last count, and again I'm remembering from memory, it's about 4,200 different private archives in Scotland. So you'll know there's maybe 32 or so local public archives. Then you've got health archives from the NHS for different regions. Sometimes they're in the same building, sometimes they're looked after by a local archive, sometimes they're completely separate. Then you have different organisations with their archives, and then you just have private collections, perhaps old lairds or people like that. There's an amazing collection in Mount Stewart, I think, which is held in this wonderful library with a gold and blue star ceiling, and it's a very, very wonderful castle setting, and it's the records of that family and the people that worked on that land. So there are lots of different places to look, and putting them together is the big thing. With Scotland, a lot of things aren't online as well, and we're working really, really hard to help. And Findmypast has, I'm not really revealing too much, but I think you can see the amount of Scottish records we've added in the past 12 months has been huge, over 12 million, and that's just for Scotland. And then we have about 85 million records to come in the next 12 months, again just for Scotland. So we add new Scottish records every month, and we continue to, and they come from all these different sources, and they're in one place, but there are still so many. So look everywhere. Use Google, use Scotland's People. And another great resource that may have been mentioned in the comments as I'm trying to see everything come together, Scotland's Places is run by the Scottish Government as well. It's a free resource. A lot of these records you can see the original images of, but we've also got some indexes of some of these records and use those indexes to help. One particular published book, which is new on Findmypast, and I don't think we've promoted it yet, so don't all rush at once to it, and you might hear more about it soon. But it's a poll tax from 1696, I believe, from Aberdeenshire, and it covers the whole county of Aberdeenshire. And it's a huge resource because it's everyone who's over a certain age. So you've got all these adults in there, and it's like a surrogate census covering all of the, the turn of the 17th century and into the 18th century. And it's a fantastic, huge thing. But this covers the whole of Scotland. It's just not indexed in that way anywhere else. But this is a great thing. We've also got poll tax and hearth tax and other things for Paisley, for Dundee, for Angus, bits of Renfrewshire. But Scotland's Places has some of these images, and these places that aren't there, as well as things like clock tax and dog tax and horse tax and carriage tax. If it could move and be taxed, they would tax it in Scotland. It was one of those places where, if those down in London could get more money out of it, then they definitely tried. Although these taxes were often very temporary, so you might find them for 2 or 3 years and then they disappear. One of the great roles in Scotland's Places that you can find is male and female servants, because it doesn't just mention the people who own the stately homes and the houses, but it also mentions the servants themselves and their names. So if your ancestor perhaps worked on some great estate, you might find them in this resource too. So that's really, really useful, and that can be helpful as well. I have a 3 times great uncle, Sue Moon Warner, who was a customs officer in 1851 in Thurso. Locally, they couldn't tell me where the customs house was. Is there anything I can look out to find it? The National Library of Scotland has a huge collection of maps which you can find, and those maps go all the way back through time. I would look at older maps of your local area, and you might find things that are no longer there. Really, really useful to do that anyway. Every time I've found a few times when I've looked at names of places that have disappeared, I've been able to find them on older maps and see where they've become. And sometimes the buildings still survive. They're just in a slightly different, named area. And so that can be really useful. So I would definitely do that as well. One of the big questions here. Let's ask. Here we go. Let's see. Melanie McKee. My great-great-grandfather, James McKee, born in Borg in Kirkcudbrightshire in 1861, but can't find him on a census till 1891. Any suggestions as to how to find him in 1871 and 1881 would be great. It would depend a lot on other bits of information. If you know maybe his occupation or the parish he was in, then I would look at these sort of things. There may be communion rolls. There may be other records that might help. Trade directories are also very, very useful. Those things can be a great help. We've got a huge collection of postal directories on Findmypast for Scotland. You may have to browse the old-fashioned way, page by page through, but go to that location, see what's there. Use county directories as well as town directories. Some of these smaller places might not be in their own town directory, but they will be in the county directory. So that will be the place to look. And at this point, this is the point where printing and reading was common. So you've got a great chance of finding them in there. Those postal directories are really big record set to look for. Other great resources to find. I've mentioned the poll tax. I've mentioned our Burgess rolls, our Testament Index. Another great resource is our Scotland Monumental Inscriptions. This is the largest collection online of any kinds of things, and these are from various different burial grounds all over Scotland. They come from family history societies, they come from different individuals, and many of them even have photographs of the gravestone itself. Fully name index, lots of information. When you look at this, you can see that we have whole families listed in these graves, and these layers are often kept for a family. So you might just find, not just one person, but everything about that person. It can really help you to rule people in or out. When you've got more common names, as can happen quite a lot in Scotland, as I know with my Crawfords and my Rennies and things like that, it means that you need to use other resources to do that. And gravestones, monumental inscriptions are a fantastic way to do it. Particularly as well when we look at our earlier ancestors, we may never get a photograph, so we can use these monumental inscriptions to find it. So it's a huge resource, and it's growing all the time. We keep adding to it. Very, very big place to look. So I would recommend that as well. More of these questions we've got here. Rabina Lees, my grandfather was Robert Bruce, but on his birth certificate states he was illegitimate and named as Robert Bruce Cairns. His mother was Anne Cairns. Don't have the father's name, but at some point he dropped the name Cairns and used Bruce as his surname. Always wondered why he would do this. So depending on the time period, you might have an extra resource. A great thing on Scotland's People on that website is when you look at a register, if there's some kind of addition or change to that register, which usually happens, at the start, you'll find what's called a register of corrected entries, and they connect these things together. So you'll be able to look at that particular entry and that particular corrected entry as well. My great-great-grandmother, her name, we always knew her as Annie. And, well, they didn't know her, but, I found her in every record as Annie. And it turns out she was born as Isabella. And it was only in this corrected entry where her name was changed around about a week after she was born. And so I looked at this Isabella. It seemed to match. It was the right sort of location. And then when I found that correction, I said, actually, she's been called Annie. And in the case of illegitimacy as well, a direct ancestor of mine, the child was born illegitimately, and the father later married that person and legitimized, and so the name was then added of the father to this register. So you might find this register correct entries being really, really useful. So that's a big thing. I see Elizabeth Jeffery saying she found the Coast Guard cottages in Peterhead on an old map. So those old map tip has said it's very, very useful as well. Barbara Hollis, hello of Casino, New South Wales, Australia. My husband's great-grandfather, William George Reed, is a brick wall for my research. He was born, according to his daughter's birthday book, 25th of March, 1850, and place, according to his grandson's memory, is maybe Edinburgh. William George Reed immigrated to South Africa, and death information shows he was born in Scotland, and no other information. No parents' names are known. I've searched over and over on Scotland's People OPRs for a birth for William, to no avail. There's so many William Reeds. No OPR dates of birth with the date recorded in William's daughter's birthday book. So feeding back into the previous comment as well, when we're looking for other things, there are other places to look. There are people who said illegitimacies. There are people who perhaps aren't in registers, so we can look at our sets of we call it the antenuptial relationship index. That's one place to look, and that will cover those people who weren't married and had children. And we also have paternity decrees and paternity cases that start very early for those people who have named a father and the father's not on any kind of parish register. So that's one place to look too. Also, Scotland had quite a tumultuous religious history when we're looking at these parish registers. So these earlier records, pre-1855. So your ancestors may not be of the established church. So there are other places to look. There are many Catholic registers. At this point, we may need to look at those registers. Findmypast has a huge collection of Catholic registers you can search with images, wonderful index, so look at those. There are also things like the Free Church. There are Methodists, there are Quakers, there are other different churches. And if you take a look on Wikipedia, there's a great explanation of how this works. And there's this very, very complicated chart, which really will make your head spin, of how these different churches have moved in and out of each other. So don't rule out that your ancestors may be in the location that you're looking, but not through the established church. And we see a lot. People will look at those parish registers, those OPRs, and find a zero and assume, well, that's it, there's nothing. And we embarked on a great campaign and indexed the free church baptisms of the Highlands. And you can search those on Findmypast. They come from the Highland Genealogical Society, a great resource, and now searchable. Previously, they're only in book form. These names, if we just looked in the OPRs, we'd never find them. So it's a great understanding. There's, I think, over 30,000 names there that otherwise have been hidden and missing. So look at other different churches, other different faiths, particularly at this sort of point of the mid-1800s where this really thrived. But then all the way through history with Covenanters and with other things, there are people who weren't part of the main established church. So if you can't find them in those parish records, don't give up and look at all the different resources for the location your ancestors are in to find that information. Jacqueline Dawson I found a record in the Register of Corrected Entries where a child's father was mentioned in the original birth, yet the child was illegitimate. The correction removed the father's name. Maybe he disputed being named. That sounds quite plausible. When you name a father, then yes, they have some responsibilities they have to provide. And perhaps if this person could argue the case that he wasn't the father, then maybe he had it removed. You'd have to look at the specifics. Depending on the time, you maybe look at Kirk sessions and other registers too. Some people often forget that they assume that when we hit 1855, that parish registers just stop. And they don't. They carry on for a little bit longer. So do take a look to see if they continue, and you might find some more information as well. It's a great thing that I find a lot of people miss out. David Malcolm is looking for ministers of the Kirk in Bendocky in the 1740s. There's a huge resource, and we've got it online. Ministers of the Church of Scotland. I assume they're from that church at this sort of point. And it's a great biography of as many ministers as they've been able to find. There are thousands of names in this collection. I think it has a Latin name I'm not going to mention because my Latin is elementary at best. But I think it's Registry Ecclesiasticae, Fasti Ecclesiae Scoticanae. There we go. Thank you, Sylvia. And we have that on our website, and it's searchable by name. All of these books put together. Use that, and you'll hopefully find a biography of your ancestor, which will tell you names of their children, their spouse, any particular places they came from, achievements that they got. It can be very, very detailed. So that'll be the place I would look straight away. Really, really useful resource. Here we can see, I see Anya has said, I've had one of those hang on a second moments mentioning the name Rennie, since I have a Helen Rennie Clelland in my tree, a second cousin. Rennie is often, the Scottish naming tradition, which is a wonderful thing that helps all of us. The Scottish naming pattern is often you'll have a maternal middle name in your family as well. So it can be a really good way to rule some people in or out, or to make a point of studying someone in more detail. If we look and we say, oh, hang on a minute, that's my family name in there must be a connection. My own sort of family in some cases have got multiple maternal middle names in there. My grandfather has his mother's maternal name and his grandmother's maternal name in there, so they can keep going, and they're brilliant to help us out where maybe our southern cousins don't have such a great resource to fall back on. And I do have some Rennie Clellands in my tree, so we might have to look at that in some more detail, because perhaps we are now related. So let's definitely take a look at that. I've managed to connect with a number of distant cousins through this, and it's wonderful to see both you meeting new people and the fact that I can do the same thing as well. So it just shows how more connected we are. I see some people talking about excisemen and things like that as well. There's a collection of excisemen that the Scottish Genealogy Society have that they might be worth getting in touch with, and they might be able to help you. So I would take a look at that too. I'm still running through all these questions. You're moving very, very quickly through, so we'll go through. So let's see. So Anya said Scottish Indexes is worth taking a look at too. It is a very good resource. A lot of those records are available on Findmypast via, a courtesy of Scottish Indexes. Thank you very much to them. And they've done some fantastic work in transcribing these records that, again, are otherwise in paper form. And when you find the record on Findmypast, then there's a link and there's a way to go through and to order the original document from them. And so definitely do that, because the original document is where you find all the good stuff. That's where things are. So we help you find it, and then you get that document with all the facts and the things in. I found a paternity case of my own for someone who was unmarried and had a child, and in there she named who she thought the father was, and they went through the to's and fro's. It was very, very detailed and hugely useful for my family history. So very, very important indeed. I see some more hellos. Hi, Karen from Enfield. Reni there as well. I see Klaas has been asking some questions. I'm living in Sweden. I'm interested in information on and how and find more about what we think are Scottish ancestors. So you'd be very surprised, everyone here, to know that Sweden and actually Poland were very, very common destinations for Scots to travel to. Also the Netherlands and Belgium, the Low Countries. Klaas is... has an ancestor called Robert Fife, possibly born in Montrose in 1587. Again, we're looking at that east coast and travelling across to the Sweden across the North Sea. It's kind of common there. And his parents may have been Alexander Fife, born 1555, and Janetta Rind of Kars, born 1550. I would take a look at those testament indexes we mentioned before. Those people who were trading and travelling on these sea journeys often made these testaments because sea journeys were unpredictable, and that was one reason why you definitely make one of these testaments in advance. I've seen names like this in there. I can't say I've seen that exact name, but that would be really encyclopedic. But there were a lot of traders that went from the east coast of Scotland to Gothenburg in particular, and many Scots went to Poland, in particular around Danzig, or Danzig as it was called then, and other places too. Scots traded as much as possible everywhere when they could go from the coast, and so there are some really established connections through there. There's a wonderful story, when we talk about how the Scots get everywhere. One of my favourite stories when I do presentations, which is something I'm going to remember. There's a small village that I went to in the mountains just outside of Milan. And in here, there was a battle of Pavia, many years ago, and it was, I think, in the 1600s. And there were some guards, écossais, the elite guards of the King of France, and the French lost this battle and they fled, and the Scots left as well, and they tried to make their way home, but they settled down for the winter in this small village in Scotland, in Italy, and the story goes that they stayed there, and they had children and married, and it became a really established part of history. And so the locals there have a very distinct dialect. They have a very interesting dialect. So I believe the town is called Guro, if I remember rightly. And I'm sure I'll share maybe on the Findmypast forum some pictures of the mayor, because he wears his kilt quite often. He's very proud of it, and they have a national day, really celebrate St Andrew's Day. They have a saltire everywhere, and they have kilts and things, and they have this dialect where in Italy, as we mentioned, I think it was last week when we talked about different things, different languages, different stuff, they say, instead of si, the local dialect would be shi, but no, they say ai, which is very similar to, perhaps a Scottish pronunciation of yes. So we can maybe see something in that. So it's really interesting. So the Scots get everywhere, and definitely look at these things. So class, certainly look for those testaments for anyone who has, people that have migrated. Also, at this point, when they've got this kind of perhaps property and this kind of thing, Burgess rolls, Burgess lists, as we mentioned as well. And these people, if they're trading, probably will have been given that. And look not just in, as we're looking for Montrose, you'll find Montrose, you might look in Dundee, but I'd also look in places like Edinburgh and Glasgow, as these people, particularly Edinburgh as the centre of the country, particularly at this point in the 1500s, they may well have arrived there as well. There are some wonderful collections of family histories that we have on Findmypast too, a big collection of around about 2 or 3 million names. Take a look in there too. There may be a published early book that might give you some details of a family. Don't take it as the truth. Use it as a hint and a guide, and go and look for the records yourself. But there may be some details of the Fifes there too, and you've got some great starts there to really move forwards. So let's see what else we've got here. Trying to see if I can trace a Scottish ancestor from East Lothian to Westmoreland in Jamaica in the late 1790s, Anna. Any suggestions where to look? So if they're moving to Jamaica, there are Jamaican records, Jamaican church records, I would assume, to start there. There are burials and cemeteries and all kinds of things. The established church was there as much as it was in Scotland. You might be able to pick up the story there. So start looking at those Caribbean registers. There are gazettes. I think relatively recently the British Newspaper Archive added their first Caribbean gazettes and Caribbean newspapers. Look there too. It might be a little early for too many newspapers, but the Gazette was government created, so that meant it did last. It was a lot earlier than many newspapers. That will be a place to look. Also take a look at plantations and registers. Perhaps your ancestor was involved in some of that. So there's a few sources for that. There's one, the Legacies of British Slave Ownership. The University College London have made a database. And if they were perhaps a plantation owner, they may be included in that, which is usually the sort of early 1800s. So they're possibly be in there. It would depend. If they were working on a plantation, then perhaps not, and look at those church registers and gazettes. Trying to find some more here. Anya said the Fasti Ecclesiae Scoticane is great, but it's often information that was given to the person recording it. That's true. A lot of records in Scotland are given by an informant. Remember that when you're looking at things like death registers, that person has died and whoever is listed is giving that information. The amount of times I've found something on a death record in Scotland, they have so much more detail, which I think everyone's jealous of, the detail you have in our Scottish civil registers. They are full of detail, but it can be wrong. My great-great-grandmother, I know, was the first of a Northern Irish family to be born in Scotland. All the other brothers and sisters were born in somewhere in Armagh, and she was the first born in Scotland. However, her death certificate says she was born in Iona on the Western Isles, and obviously that's not true at all. I found the proof, I found the evidence, and it was very easy to disprove. But that was what her son thought, and put that in. So it was one of those things. She had a name McKee, and McKee traditionally comes from the Western Isles. However, she'd actually changed her name from McAfee, and it was very, very Northern Irish. So you can see if you know that. So that's a thing to remember. So when you look at these, remember who is giving that information, and that's always something important to think about in all of the records, wherever you're looking in the world, to bear that in mind, because that can really change. Perhaps if your ancestor had to be a certain age to join the military, then they might massage their age up a little bit or down to make sure that they can get that money and food and everything else. Angie Rooney has a lot of Robert Bruces in her tree, often with Bruce as a middle name. She assumed, maybe wrongly, they were trying to keep the claim being descended from Robert the Bruce. There's a lot of pride in Scotland's wonderful history of proud and noble standing against others. So lots of people are named after these great heroes. There are lots of William Wallaces. There are lots of people with a different name who are called William, and their middle name is Wallace because they want that William Wallace connection. And Robert Bruce in the same way. Sometimes it can be just because of this pride in someone's nationality and someone's heritage and culture. Particularly, we mentioned Walter Scott and this Scot mania that sort of happened, the tartan fever that took Scotland and the rest of the UK from the sort of 1820s onwards, starting I think about 1817, 1819. And this meant that this brave, strong Highland warrior was something really a source of pride and a sort of real sort of energy that was used. Many Scots joined the military. Many Scots, if you look at our military records, military service records, 1760 to 1920, they're really, really useful. And lots of Scots in there. They give you full physical descriptions as well, so really helpful. But there are some people that may have, if they're using names like this at this point, they may not be using the surname pattern, which we mentioned before, and they may, so bear that in mind as well. But they may just be very, very patriotic and very proud of their Scottish roots at this point too, as this escalated at this point to such a degree. So think of that as well. We're seeing, here we go. Emma Maxwell said, we've seen fathers named in 1855 certificates when they shouldn't really have been. Definitely worth looking at Kirk Sessions records. Yes, 100%. Those Kirk Sessions records are available on paper when archives open, but again, hopefully soon they'll be online. I think we're all crossing our fingers for that, and we're definitely going to, I think, as Sylvia says, probably break the website as soon as that happens. Susan saying hello from Montreal. She misses visiting Dundee, and I'm sure Dundee misses you as well. It's seen a lot of wonderful change over the past few years. It's a wonderful place to live, and it's a wonderful place to have ancestors from. Some people don't realise that Dundee has one of the highest numbers of Irish ancestors anywhere in the country, second only to Liverpool during the 1800s. And so there are a lot of people here with an Irish connection, and so there's a lot of cross movement. When Dundee became very, very large during the period of the giant jute mills and the whaling industry, again, lots of people came, as we mentioned, from the east coast around, people who perhaps good at ships, were moving down and taking work there. I do remember a question about shipping and about trying to find shipping registers. And I remember that being asked. I think, yes, it was Tess Martin. She had some ancestors from Fraserburgh in the northeast, which I think is in Aberdeenshire, and they can't seem to get too far back. And they're looking for finding out who worked on which boat, who owned which boats, finding list of fishermen in newspapers, but everyone has the same surname, no identifying details. It's a bit useless. So we have a wonderful collection of records of people who worked on ships and boats for the East Coast and for the rest of Scotland coming relatively soon. They were published a while ago by a wonderful man called David Dobson. His works are amazing. We've published a lot of them as indexes, and they're almost the last word in a lot of these things. He's like a machine. The transcriptions he does are fantastic, and they're huge and can guide you to records. Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire archives have a lot of port records and a lot of records of those people who came in. But these registers have been indexed in this way, and they might really help you. I know that there's a number of thousand waiting to go and to be published soon. So keep an eye on Findmypast, but look at these port records. They might help you. If your ancestor was a master or a mate or something along those lines, something technical, then they're most likely named in here. It will give you the name of the ship. It will give you the name of the tonnage or the type of ship. Sometimes it will tell you what it was carrying. It can be a very, very useful resource. If you can't wait, then those books are available to purchase, and they could help you. But if you wait a little while, there'll be name index, and all of these books will be put together in one place. So that will be really, really helpful for you. Here we go. Let's have a look. Martine Sinker. It's very hard to find about Jewish families. So there weren't too many Jewish families in Scotland. I think there are only maybe 2,000 or 3,000 in Scotland throughout history up until perhaps the 1920s and 30s. But there's a wonderful Jewish society in Scotland that might be able to help you and tell you a lot. There are some great Jewish cemeteries in Scotland that are relatively well kept, and there are lots of Jewish records that can help you that I think will be really useful to consult, and I think that society have done some work in indexing and collecting together. So I would look for them and get in touch. And if you're looking for a broader view of Jewish ancestry in the UK, then the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain are really, really helpful too. I've spoken there a couple of times, and I found them really, really helpful and useful. I see Patricia is pleased to have found the broadcast. The current topic isn't relevant, so watch out for more broadcasts. Yes, do. I know we're rounding to an end, and it's one of those things that we're going to try and cover things for everything all the way while we're cooped up indoors. There are so many different things that people have interests and so many different passions that we're trying to fill them all and trying to cover them. This is just one topic. I know, so we did Italy the other week, and there'll be plenty of other different things to ask, and I'm sure I'll be back at some point talking about something else. We've had some Irish research, we've had newspapers, we've had tracing women. All these different things are all useful to different people, and you never know when it might be useful. The amount of times that I've dismissed a certain area of the world and then suddenly found out that that's where I need to focus my research. Currently, I'm desperately looking for Maltese records because I found my ancestors in Malta. I would never have expected this and never have really dug deep here up until around about a month ago, and I'm waiting very patiently for my Maltese birth and death certificates from their register office to arrive in the post, which I'm sure they'll be a little later. But it just shows that you never know where you might need to look. And so some people already know they've got Scottish roots. Some people may in future, and it could be useful. But if we keep trying to do as many of these topics as possible, then obviously there'll definitely be something for you soon. So keep watching. And if you have any other general questions, then the Findmypast forum, the little group, is also useful too. So I know there are so many of these questions that you've asked, and it's only fair that you all get an answer if you've asked. So I'm going to do as I did last time. I'm going to get back into these comments afterwards, and I'm going to try and answer as many as I can myself. So if you've asked a question, I'm going to try my hardest to get to them all. Thank you very much for staying with me. I hope you've had a really good time. I've definitely enjoyed it. I definitely need a bit of a sip of water after all of this conversation. But it looks like there have been lots of people answering questions as well and chatting, and that's the great thing. It's great to have something to do together during this, and to do some family history is a wonderful pastime while we're cooped up indoors as well. So thank you very much for joining me. And I really hope to see you again soon, if whether it's on the Findmypast forum or here or anywhere else. And in the meantime, have fun tracing your ancestors. I hope some of these new resources have been helpful. I hope you can find some new things, and if you do, definitely share on the forum, share on the Facebook page, tell everyone. And look out, join our, subscribe to our newsletter, find out about those new records that come every Friday, and keep looking for those ancestors, because I'm certain that in the next 12 months there are going to be many more Scottish records that are going to be useful, and I'm sure we're all going to find some new things together. So thanks very much for coming, and I hope to see you again very soon indeed. Take care.